60-year-old John Sweeney is a criminal like no other, describing himself as the scalp hunter.
He had the axe over his head ready to finish me up. I put my hands over my face and shut my eyes ready to die.
The brutality of his crimes would stun detectives.
In the last 25 years, I struggle to think of a more dangerous man that has ever come before a court in this country.
Despite going to extreme lengths to conceal the evidence of his crimes, he would tease the police with bizarre clues in his artwork.
John Sweeney went to the extent of sawing off people's hands, head and feet to cover up his killings, and yet had left such a trail of information within his paintings and poems.
His terrifying attacks would lead British and European officers on a large-scale hunt across the continent in a race to catch him before he struck again.
The last thing we wanted was for him to be released and possibly commence a relationship with another woman, and then for that relationship to turn violent, and given his track record, who knows what could have happened.
I'm Dermot Murnaghan, and the actions of John Sweeney are crimes that shook Britain.
In the late 1980s, itinerant tradesman John Sweeney found himself in London. Brought up in northwest England, he'd travelled extensively, seemingly without putting down any significant roots. However, his arrival in the capital marked what looked like a change in his fortunes when he began a relationship with Melissa Halstead.
John Sweeney landed on his feet when he came to London. He met an attractive American model from Ohio called Melissa, working in the West End, and they started living together in some of the most exclusive areas of London.
John Sweeney was working as a carpenter, and he was working on a set for a fashion shoot, which Melissa was working as a photographer, and that's where they first met. John had quite a bohemian lifestyle. By that I mean he would draw sketches and then he smoked cannabis together. So there seemed to be a mutual attraction between the two.
At that time she would have been a stranger to London. Although she was living in a fashionable area, she probably would not have had too many friends. And John was somebody who knew the London life.
John Sweeney thought that he had an artistic gene in him, which must have attracted Melissa. She was interested in the arts. So they had something in common, and that's what drew them together.
Although they initially got on well, things started to sour when John Sweeney's domineering nature prompted a number of rows that soon became violent. On 2 occasions, Sweeney was convicted of assaulting Melissa. The young American model had unwittingly fallen into the violent clutches of a serial killer.
Melissa's sister came over from America and stayed with them in their Chelsea flat on one occasion, and she witnessed the acrimony within their relationship for herself. She took an instant dislike to John Sweeney and felt that he was not right for her sister.
In late 1987, Melissa was deported from the UK when her visa expired. Realizing an opportunity to break away from her unstable relationship with John, she moved to Vienna. But she wasn't free of him for long.
The love of his life was leaving, and as far as he was concerned, and he didn't really want that relationship to end, so he followed her.
The domestic violence continued, and during a particularly ferocious row, John attacked Melissa with a hammer, cracking her skull, resulting in her requiring emergency surgery.
This was a moment, surely, when he would be put away and she would be free from him.
For the brutal attack on his then-girlfriend, Sweeney was arrested and sentenced to a prison term in Vienna.
Melissa made a number of phone calls to her sister at this time, basically opening her heart about her relationship with John Sweeney.
The discussion went along the lines that the relationship wasn't necessarily working, and if for some reason you couldn't find me, then rest assured he would have probably killed me and gotten rid of me.
Despite this sinister foresight, John Sweeney's emotional power over Melissa was so strong that she ended up appealing to the Austrian authorities, asking for Sweeney to be released.
He actually did manage to control Melissa Halstead in a way that she couldn't really have predicted, because having battered her really grievously, he managed to get her to release him from prison by being really charming and sorry.
But she couldn't break away from him, and it was to cost her her life.
In search of a fresh start, John and Melissa relocated to Amsterdam, where they found an apartment to rent and life appeared to settle down.
The landlord thought they were model tenants, a nice couple, paid their rent on time, caused no trouble, seemed to get on with everybody.
Later that year, in November 1989, 33-year-old Melissa made a phone call home to her family in America. Tragically for them, no one was home to take the call. What they couldn't have realized was that it would be the last time their daughter would be heard from alive.
One thing she did without fail every November was she always rang home to wish her mother a happy birthday. In November '89, Melissa made the call home and left a message on the answer phone.
Hi Mom, it's Melissa. I just called to wish you a happy birthday. I'm going to be getting a fax machine sometime soon, so I'll call and be able to leave that number with you anyway. Have a good time and take care of yourself. Goodbye, I love you.
This was the last call that Melissa ever made to her family.
Coming up next on Crimes That Shook Britain, the extent of John Sweeney's violent past is revealed, and police find the first evidence of a trail of death and destruction that led across Europe.
When they remove the remains from the duffel bag, they find the dismembered parts of a female. The head is missing and both hands are missing.
The relationship between John Sweeney and his American girlfriend Melissa was marked by violent encounters due to Sweeney's aggressive temper and lack of self-control, characteristics that began to reveal themselves much earlier on in his life.
John Sweeney was born and brought up in the Liverpool area, Skelmersdale.
He was a carpenter by trade. He was something of an itinerant Liverpudlian who moved around Europe and the UK.
In 1974, and living in Skelmersdale in Lancashire, 18-year-old John Sweeney married a local woman named Anne Bramley.
I think it's fair to say quite a tempestuous relationship. There's certainly evidence that there was violence within the marriage.
In fact, John's behaviour was so unstable due to his heavy drinking that Anne had asked him to leave the family home, and she herself had moved out to stay with a friend. But John Sweeney wasn't someone who liked to follow orders.
Anne was at a neighbour's house just for a social visit when they heard a noise next door. An officer attended the property, and on searching the house, John Sweeney jumped out from behind a wardrobe door, brandishing a hammer and an axe. He did it to surprise Anne, so one might think that was quite a surprise she would have got. It's horrifying to think what may have happened if the policeman hadn't been there and it had been Anne that had searched the house on her own.
John Sweeney was arrested by the officer for breach of the peace. Terrified, Anne and her young family relocated to a secret location elsewhere in the country. Unable to track them down, John moved down to London, where he met the model Melissa Halstead.
Having been together for 3 years in a relationship filled with explosive violence that saw John Sweeney jailed for a hammer attack, Melissa chose to remain with him. In 1989, they moved to Amsterdam, and their life appeared to be less volatile.
She was obviously besotted by him as well. For her to have been significantly attacked by him and receiving significant injuries, and she was still prepared to remain in a relationship with him.
In April 1990, John and Melissa's landlord was surprised to return from his Easter holidays to find their apartment empty.
When he came back, he had no contact with her, and that for him was out of character because she was normally paying her rent on time. He then realized that, she wasn't there, and a lot of her belongings were also missing, so he had made an assumption, rightly or wrongly, that she had left.
A few weeks later, on the 3rd of May, a passerby spotted a duffel bag floating in the Westersingle Canal in Rotterdam.
The police are obviously called and a crime scene set up. When they remove the remains from the duffel bag, they find the dismembered parts of a female. The head is missing and both hands are missing.
There was no prospect of identifying the victim through dental records or fingerprints, and with Rotterdam being one of Europe's busiest bustling seaports, it was very, very difficult, in fact impossible, to locate any witnesses who'd seen anyone dumping the bag in the canal.
With no scientific way of establishing identification, the Rotterdam police's investigation stalled. 1 month later, the Dutch authorities 36 miles south in Amsterdam received a call from Melissa's mother. She'd grown concerned about Melissa's welfare as she'd made no contact with her family since leaving the answer phone message a year before. Aware of Melissa and John's violent relationship, her mother worried that something grave had happened to her. Local detectives visited their deserted apartment.
The police in Amsterdam then did a thorough forensic search of the address, and that didn't provide any indication whatsoever that any foul play had taken place at the address.
With no evidence of anything untoward happening to Melissa and without any means of contacting the couple, the officers had no reason to believe Melissa was a victim of crime, and their investigations ended. This decision would unwittingly let one of Europe's most vicious criminals slip through the net.
Unbeknownst to the authorities, Sweeney had left Amsterdam in April 1990. Notably, he was travelling alone. He arrived back in London 2 years later, where he met nurse Delia Balmer in a local pub in Camden.
I saw this guy come in, and he sat at the very other end of the bar, and he kept looking at me. Then he got up, he came to my side of the bar, stood next to me, and he said, "Would you like a drink?" And I thought, oh well, it wouldn't harm just to have one drink.
They quickly formed a relationship, and within a couple of months, both of them were living together. He was somebody who had been reasonably well travelled. She liked to travel. I think they even ended up going to Mexico at some point. So there was a relationship of some sort between the two.
I needed someone because I felt so alone. And I thought he was helping me. I thought he cared and looked after me. And I was alone.
The longer their relationship went on, Dina realised that she'd made a dreadful mistake. John Sweeney developed some rather alarming habits. He used to keep a tarantula spider in a glass tank, and he used to sit and watch the spider for hours, and he would also read very macabre magazines.
Before he came and moved in there, I thought, oh, I've got somebody to talk to now, and we're going to have such good talks. But it never happened. He'd just sit and stare at the tarantula.
Over time, John started to reveal his controlling nature.
I wasn't allowed out of the flat without him. He was there all the time. He would even follow me to the bathroom and watch me go to the toilet.
2 years into the relationship, with John Sweeney becoming increasingly controlling, Delia asked him to move out of their home. Unhappy with this, John waited to confront Delia on her return to the flat.
He had ropes there ready, and he grabbed my arms and he put me back and tied my wrists to the bed. So I was tied to the bed all night long. And he ranted and raved and he had my kitchen knife and his gun hidden nearby. I felt like I was in a padded cell with a complete maniac.
Panicked that Delia's work colleagues might raise the alarm if she failed to arrive for her shift, John Sweeney decided to allow Delia to return to work. Using a technique he'd repeated with the former women in his life, John attempted to charm Delia into believing he'd changed, hoping she'd keep quiet about the attacks. Living in fear, she decided not to report the incident.
Escape was not an option. I thought about how can I get out, but I thought there's no way. if I try to escape, something is going to happen.
In the weeks that followed, Delia was relieved to hear that John was going abroad to work in Germany, and she took the opportunity to change the locks of the flat. However, John didn't stay away.
And he came out, he says, "What did you do that for?" He stuck his fingers down my throat and he says, "Are you going to stop screaming?" And I'd already stopped. I thought, this is it. The knives are in here.
Once again, Delia found herself held hostage in her own home. This time, her work colleagues were concerned for her welfare and contacted the police, and as a result, the authorities visited the flat.
The police came. He wouldn't answer, but in the end, he's saying, "Just go to the door and tell them everything is all right, and as soon as we've stopped talking, I'm leaving." I stood up, walked to the door, felt his presence behind me, opened the door, and I rushed out of the door, out into the street.
Sweeney was arrested, but when detectives went into Delia's home to remove John's possessions, they made a chilling discovery.
When he was removed from the flat by police, Delia pointed out his belongings, and officers behind the bath panel found what can only be described as a killer's kit bag. Contained within it was a tarpaulin rubber sheet, lengths of rope, surgical gloves, and rolls of duct tape. All the things you might need if you were clearing up after a crime scene.
Coming up next on Crimes That Shook Britain, John Sweeney was back behind bars, but another ill-fated decision saw this cruel and sadistic man back out on the streets once more, and this time he wanted revenge.
Being someone who would not be told what to do by the law or anyone, he made a beeline straight for Delia with very harmful intent.
As she neared her address, little did she know that lying in wait was John Sweeney, armed with an axe and a knife.
In the winter of 1994, John Sweeney found himself in prison, on remand awaiting trial for assaulting his then-girlfriend Delia Balmer after a terrifying attack on her own doorstep. But in a cruel twist of fate, he was about to be released back onto the streets.
As it got to towards the end of December 1994, with Christmas approaching, there was an amnesty. Prisoners in custody for certain offences could be released, which would mean they could spend Christmas at home with their families. One such person who benefited from this amnesty was John Sweeney.
Despite his history of extreme violence, John Sweeney was released, but on strict bail conditions, requiring him to move back to Skelmersdale.
I told the police what he would do to me, what time he would do it, when he would be there, and how he would do it. I was given no protection.
Being someone who would not be told what to do by the law or anyone, he made a beeline straight for Delia with very harmful intent.
As she neared her address, little did she know that lying in wait was John Sweeney, armed with an axe and a knife.
That night when I cycled home from work was the darkest day of the year. I just felt like I had no protection. I knew I was in danger. I was looking this way and that way. He brings out the axe. First, with the wooden handle of the axe, he bashes me. I put my arms out for protection. With the large wooden handle of the axe, bang here. I tried to kick him, hit him in the right place, but I missed. So with my broken, bleeding arms, I pulled my bicycle on top of me to try and have some protection. Then he stabbed me through this breast into the lung. And then he stabbed me through the thigh.
Delia describes hearing the clang of the knife and the axe as it hit against the frame of the bicycle, which she'd put on top of her to protect herself.
He had the axe over his head, ready to finish me off. I put my hands over my face and shut my eyes, ready to die.
Delia's desperate screams alerted the attention of a neighbour.
He came out to see what all the commotion was about, armed with a baseball bat, and he could see Sweeney attacking Delia. He leapt to Delia's defence and attacked Sweeney, hitting him on the back. with the baseball bat, which caused Sweeney to flee the scene, leaving Delia fighting for her life.
Despite suffering appalling near-fatal injuries, which included numerous stab wounds, Delia survived the frenzied attack. Now on the run, John Sweeney fled to his former wife's home, much to her horror, having previously subjected her to a number of terrifying assaults during their marriage. With no idea of the events that had taken place, she allowed him into her home.
He stayed the night there and kept himself to himself. However, he did tell his son that he'd done things that would make your hair stand on end.
He had no qualms at all about imposing himself for one night on a family that would probably be absolutely in shock to see him.
Following the attack on Delia, there was an active manhunt to track down John Sweeney, who they knew was armed and extremely dangerous. They visited his family home in Skelmersdale, but he wasn't there. After a while, the trail ran cold and the whereabouts of John Sweeney wasn't known.
One of Britain's most dangerous men had effectively disappeared into thin air and remained at large. Once Delia was able to give a statement to the police, she revealed some shocking information.
What she told them was she'd seen a picture of a young woman in John Sweeney's belongings.
He says, oh, that was my American girlfriend, Melissa.
And John Sweeney told her that he came home one day, found her in bed with 2 German men, so he shot all 3 of them.
He said, I didn't know what to do with the bodies, so I sat with them for 3 days. On the 3rd day, I cut them up and threw them in the canal.
Alarmed by this information, the Metropolitan Police immediately contacted the Dutch authorities. Their files did indeed contain the report of the body that was found in Rotterdam in 1990. But chillingly, they also discovered a report of a second body found in near identical circumstances in Amsterdam 2 years later. Could one of these be the remains of the still missing Melissa Halstead? And what's more, could the 2 deaths be laid at the hands of one killer?
In 1992, another dismembered female body in a suitcase is found in an Amsterdam canal. The body was completely dismembered in several parts, and the hands haven't been fully removed from the body, the fingertips were removed.
With Delia's statement seemingly a chilling portent of the remains found in the canal, Dutch police requested a familial DNA sample from Melissa's family to determine whether her profile matched the dismembered body. After all, they had no reason to suspect that Rotterdam remains were Melissa. To their knowledge, she'd never even visited the city.
The DNA was sent from America to the Netherlands, but unfortunately the samples were negative, so the Amsterdam police thought they may have solved the riddle of the dismembered female body from 1992, but unfortunately that wasn't the case.
Frustratingly for her family, Melissa Halstead's disappearance remained a complete mystery.
In February 2001, and in a gruesome echo of events in Holland years earlier, 2 boys made an horrific discovery in the Regent's Canal in London.
Apart from the one holdall that the boys have fished onto the side, they find 5 others. All 6 holdalls contain a total of 10 body parts. The body parts have been weighed down in the holdalls with various bricks, ceramic tiles and other various wrappings. The holdalls and their contents are taken to the local mortuary where they're examined, and they're found to be the various body parts of a young female. The head, the hands and the feet are all missing.
Police tested the body against the DNA database. Detectives formally declared the victim as a 31-year-old Liverpudlian woman named Paula Fields.
Paula Fields was brought up in Merseyside and came to London believing this was where her future lay. Unfortunately, she hit a spiral of drugs and prostitution. When Paula went missing, the police looked into her background and lifestyle and found that among her friends was a man called Joe Scouse.
Whilst in London, Paula met a man called Joe, also from Merseyside. They got on well, both being from the same area. They clearly liked each other's company. However, there were times when Joe would lose patience with Paula. He talked about having lost his mobile phone and money. He would challenge Paula about it, but she would deny it. There was another occasion when Paula would buy drugs from a dealer in the street, and rather than pay the dealer, she would say that Joe would pay, which upset him greatly.
Due to her chaotic lifestyle, it was not uncommon for Paula to go missing for a few days here and there. But in December 2000, her family grew increasingly concerned when she failed to make contact over the Christmas period. It was crucial detectives identified Joe Scouse.
Paula's associates and friends revealed that Joe Scouse was living at a house in Digby Crescent, Finsbury Park.
The initial inquiries weren't able to identify who this person called Joe Scouse was. At Digby Crescent, there was a male who had also been spoken to, and that individual was somebody called Anthony Sweeney.
Anthony Sweeney was placed under observation by undercover officers, as they couldn't be sure that he wasn't actually Joe Scouse.
Whilst under observation, he met with another man. Officers were surprised to learn that this other man was in fact Anthony's brother, John. Having run John Sweeney's details through the national computer, they were amazed to find that John Sweeney was in fact wanted for the attack on Delia Balmer in 1994 and had been on the run for over 5 years.
While Sweeney was on the run, he used a number of aliases. He did a number of different jobs, one of which happened to be at a building site very close to the Old Bailey.
The terrible truth behind Sweeney's reign of violence was about to be revealed. Far from being solely responsible for the attack on Delia, the scale of Sweeney's crimes was about to come to light. Investigators waited for an opportune moment to pounce, seizing 45-year-old John Sweeney when he made an appointment at a mobile phone shop. The man who had evaded police for more than 5 years was finally in their custody.
Once Sweeney had been arrested, police went to search his property. They found a selection of guns, ammunition, a machete, a garrote, a wig. It seemed like an everyday arsenal of weaponry of a very violent and dangerous man.
In 2001, John Sweeney was charged with the attempted murder of Delia Balmer, along with firearms offences in relation to the weapons found in his bedsit. He was also arrested on suspicion of the murder of Paula Fields.
He admitted that he knew Paula and admitted that on occasions their relationship had been quite violent. There was some evidence in the bricks that had been used to weigh down the body parts in the holdalls. The soil samples that were contained on the bricks were compared to the garden in Digby Crescent, and there was some evidence that that soil could have come from the garden, which would have provided a physical link between Sweeney and Paula.
We didn't have a crime scene. We didn't know where she was killed, and we didn't know how she was killed. We didn't have any other opportunities in terms of significant witnesses who would have witnessed the assault or the aftermath.
The Crown Prosecution Service made the decision that, taking everything into account, there was insufficient evidence to charge John Sweeney with Paula's murder.
Sadly, the investigation into Paula's death stalled. There were no further lines of inquiry, and the case was closed.
John Sweeney remained charged with the attempted murder of Delia Balmer, a charge he denied, resulting in a trial at the Old Bailey.
In one final twist, in order to prolong Delia's agony, John Sweeney knew that a not guilty plea would mean Delia would have to attend court and give evidence. She was a very, very reluctant witness and bore the physical and the emotional scars of his attack.
I knew that if I went to court, I'd be treated like dirt and made to feel like I was guilty. I would be traumatized again, and I didn't want to go.
Despite her fears, Delia bravely gave evidence at a trial which began at the Old Bailey in 2002. John Sweeney was found guilty of her attempted murder and given a life sentence with a minimum tariff of just 9 years.
After all the hell I had been through, and I'm the one who's being punished. I've got this pain, scars, everything for the rest of my life.
He would be considered for release in April 2011. Coming up next on Crimes That Shook Britain. Through their investigations into the murder of Paula Fields, police stumbled on some unique clues into the fate of Melissa Halstead, penned by John Sweeney himself.
They were very enlightening to police because when you looked at them more closely, some of them also contained what appeared to be messages.
In 2001, the Metropolitan Police finally caught up with 45-year-old John Sweeney after 6 years on the run. Following his conviction, he would go on to serve a 9-year sentence for the attempted murder of Delia Balmer. But there'd not been enough evidence to prove that he'd murdered Paula Fields. But during their investigations into her case, police had stumbled on a treasure trove of new clues, potentially revealing the fate of former girlfriend Melissa Halstead, who'd been missing since 1990.
They found a most extraordinary array of artwork and poetry of the most dark and sinister nature. There was pictures of Sweeney, self-portraits labelled Scalp Hunter, portrayed as a devil with a blood-soaked axe.
A lot of these drawings and sketches and poems were specifically about both Delia and Melissa. And they were very enlightening to police because when you looked at them more closely, some of them also contained what appeared to be messages. For example, one picture had correction fluid on it, but then when you looked underneath it, it had Melissa, born 1956, and then died, and a blank. How did Sweeney know she died? Only the killer would know that.
John Sweeney's painting of the romantic weekend in Vienna is clearly a reference to himself and Melissa. It shows extreme violence and it shows the actual relationship, and in fact the portrayals, silhouetted, do look like Sweeney and Melissa at that time.
But the most significant piece of evidence they found was a scrap of paper with a poem written on it.
His poetry included the most callous rhymes. He wrote about Melissa being fed to the fishes and being chopped into bits. Amsterdam was the pits. Most sinister and childlike rhyming with a macabre touch to it.
They're not lyrically brilliant. However, they mention specific cities and locations so that you could piece together the real-world movements of John Sweeney and Melissa.
Despite finding such compelling clues within the pictures and the poems, Melissa's disappearance fell outside the Metropolitan Police's jurisdiction, meaning British detectives were not able to make any further inquiries into her case.
In 2008, I was at my desk and the phone rang. When I answered, it was a detective from Holland.
In 2007, the Dutch police had formed a cold case review team, which began investigating unsolved crimes, some stretching back decades. They were now able to run a profile of the unidentified body found in the Rotterdam Canal almost 18 years earlier against their updated DNA database. Their system brought up a match.
He was 100% sure that the dismembered female body from Rotterdam in 1990 was in fact that of Melissa Halstead. This was astonishing news because first we had Paula, who turned up in the Regent's Canal dismembered. She had a relationship with John Sweeney. Now I'm hearing that another of John Sweeney's girlfriends, Melissa Halstead, turns up in a Rotterdam Canal, also dismembered. This just had to be more than coincidence.
Unfortunately for her family, the truth about Melissa's fate had been sat on a police DNA database for nearly 20 years. It had only been tested against the body pulled from the Amsterdam waters because there'd been nothing to link her to Rotterdam at the time of her disappearance.
On hearing that Melissa's remains had finally been identified, we were quite euphoric in the thought that we could use each case to bolster the other, bearing in mind we had very little physical evidence to go on to prove that John Sweeney murdered either of these women. But of course we had a problem because we had one victim in London which was within our jurisdiction, and we had a second victim in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, which clearly wasn't. The murder investigation into Paula Fields' death had been closed in 2003, but now there we were 5 years further on, where this case was now ready to be reopened.
Joining forces with another country to prove one man guilty of murder had never been done before.
There had been occasions when different police forces had worked in people trafficking, drugs and firearms offences. It was the first time that we had a UK force investigating a murder investigation with an outside agency.
But there were only a few years remaining of John Sweeney's prison sentence. The countdown was on to gather enough evidence before he was due for release.
The clock was ticking, and it meant that we had to therefore do an awful lot of things very quickly. But that investigation was fairly complex.
The last thing we wanted was for him to be released, possibly commence a relationship with another woman, and then for that relationship to turn violent, and given his track record, who knows what could have happened. So the race was on, really, to try and complete our investigation before he was released from prison. It was clear from the outset that there were going to be lots of challenges ahead. For example, we don't speak Dutch.
The Dutch authorities had to give us complete ownership of it. So in other words, they had to hand over their investigation, which created its own problems. They would say, well, what happens if you don't do a good job in investigating our case, and we have lost the opportunities?
Witnesses had to be revisited, had to reread their statements. Some of them wanted things changed, others didn't agree with things that had been said, so it was a mammoth task to have all that done.
The trial at London's Old Bailey began in March 2011, just a few weeks before 55-year-old John Sweeney was due to be released from prison. He was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 of perverting the course of justice by disposing of Paula's body in the canal. He pleaded not guilty.
We were reasonably confident. You can never be 100% sure that your case is absolutely watertight and that you will get a conviction.
What was the chances of somebody having a girlfriend who is found dismembered in a canal? Once, you would say that person is pretty unfortunate. For a second time, you would say, what are the chances of that happening to somebody on 2 occasions?
However, we were acutely aware that we had no physical forensic evidence or any significant forensic evidence with which to link John Sweeney to both killings of Paula Fields and Melissa Halstead.
By entering the witness box to give his evidence, Sweeney had to produce a defence as to why women who he had been linked with in the past had ended up brutally and horribly murdered.
There was another individual called Anthony Hardy, who, a very short distance from where Paula's remains were found, had also murdered and dismembered 2 women.
A tramp scavenging for food found the legs of one of the women he'd killed in a bin bag behind a pub in Camden, North London.
The reason he was likely to be a problem for us is that I could see that John Sweeney's defence could easily be, well, I did murder Paula Fields, Anthony Hardy did. Of course, the problem for Sweeney was that that explains Paula's death in his defence, but it doesn't explain Melissa's. If he could have convinced the jury that he didn't kill Paula, then our case against him for killing Melissa could also collapse, because we needed each case to bolster the other.
Hardy grabbed women and dumped them in rubbish bins and made no attempt to cover the evidence. Melissa and Paula both suffered a very different fate. Having been killed, they were then shoved into bags or holdalls and dumped in the canal. 2 hugely different series of murders with no possible connection other than the fact that they were both based around North London.
Despite his attempts to confuse the jury with his line of defence, it was ultimately Sweeney's own hand that revealed himself to have the mind of a murderer.
In the cold light of a courtroom, John Sweeney's artwork began to look very different. Clearly, It correlated very well with many of the actual activities around the killings and many of the kind of products of those killings, i.e. the dismembered bodies themselves. John Sweeney had perhaps revealed too much in his little ramblings and his little jokes to himself in his drawings.
From the moment the jury saw the artwork, they knew that whatever he said in his defence, that they were sitting opposite a seriously, seriously dangerous man.
Ultimately, there's no doubt at all that in the context of the case, they did prove to be his downfall. And although he'd never admit it, I'm sure that he regrets bitterly ever drawing them.
After a trial lasting 4 weeks, 55-year-old John Sweeney was found guilty of all charges and ordered to serve a whole life tariff, meaning he'll spend the rest of his life in prison.
John Sweeney had always convinced himself throughout that he would never be convicted of this heinous crime. However, he did not contemplate the determination and the resolve of the Joint Investigation Team.
John Sweeney received a whole life tariff. Not that many people do. He was so brutal, so ungiving, and consistently so throughout his life.
It's never right to say that you're happy when a person is convicted. I think the word is satisfied, that the culmination of all our hard work and the hard work of our Dutch colleagues had all been supported by the jury in reaching that verdict. But I think most of all I was satisfied for the friends and the family of both Melissa Halstead and Paula Fields.
We know she is never coming back, and we never said goodbye. We hope to God that John Sweeney will never be released.
It must be very upsetting and distressing for both families to know that certain body parts are missing and will probably never be found. But I think this really shows the control and the contempt that Sweeney has shown over his victims.
Whilst John Sweeney is now behind bars, some detectives believe he's responsible for more as yet unsolved crimes, that he may have killed others.
Sweeney boasted of his attacks in hundreds of paintings and violent poems. He's considered so dangerous he's likely to spend the rest of his life in prison. Detectives believe he may have killed at least 3 other women in London alone.
And as John Sweeney contemplates a life behind bars, I would like to assure him that this investigation will continue as we seek to identify and trace other possible victims within the UK, Holland and across Europe.
It could be wide of the mark. I take the view that he's probably done others, but I think he'll take that to his grave.
There's no doubt in my mind that John Sweeney is a cruel and sadistic individual who, apart from being extremely violent, just seems to lack emotion towards his victims.
In the last 25 years, I struggle to think of a more dangerous man that has ever come before a court in this country.
There's no such thing as justice. I'm the one in pain. I'm the one with the scars. There's no such thing as closure.
Thanks to tenacious detective work that spanned Europe over several years, one of Britain's most evil killers will never again be able to walk our streets. Whether we'll ever know the true scale of his atrocities remains to be seen. Join me next time for more crimes that shook Britain.
Well, 60-year-old John Sweeney is a criminal like no other, describing himself as the scalp hunter.
He had the axe over his head ready to finish me up. I put my hands over my face and shut my eyes ready to die.
The brutality of his crimes would stun detectives.
In the last 25 years, I struggle to think of a more dangerous man that has ever come before a court in this country.
Despite going to extreme lengths to conceal the evidence of his crimes, he would tease the police with bizarre clues in his artwork.
John Sweeney went to the extent of sawing off people's hands, head and feet to cover up his killings, and yet had left such a trail of information within his paintings and poems.
His terrifying attacks would lead British and European officers on a large-scale hunt across the continent in a race to catch him before he struck again.
The last thing we wanted was for him to be released and possibly commence a relationship with another woman, and then for that relationship to turn violent, and given his track record, who knows what could have happened.
I'm Dermot Murnaghan, and the actions of John Sweeney are crimes that shook Britain.
In the late 1980s, itinerant tradesman John Sweeney found himself in London. Brought up in northwest England, he'd travelled extensively, seemingly without putting down any significant roots. However, his arrival in the capital marked what looked like a change in his fortunes when he began a relationship with Melissa Halstead.
John Sweeney landed on his feet when he came to London, met a attractive American model from Ohio called Melissa, working in the West End, and they started living together in some of the most exclusive areas of London.
John Sweeney was working as a carpenter, and he was working on a set for a fashion shoot, which Melissa was working as a photographer, and that's where they first met. John had quite a bohemian lifestyle. By that I mean he would draw sketches and they'd smoke cannabis together. So there seemed to be a mutual attraction between the two.
At that time she would have been a stranger to London. Although she was living in a fashionable area, she probably would not have had too many friends. And John was somebody who knew the London life.
John Sweeney thought that he had an artistic gene in him, which must have attracted Melissa. She was interested in the arts. So they had something in common, and that's what drew them together.
Although they initially got on well, things started to sour when John Sweeney's domineering nature prompted a number of rows that soon became violent. On 2 occasions, Sweeney was convicted of assaulting Melissa. The young American model had unwittingly fallen into the violent clutches of a serial killer.
Melissa's sister came over from America and stayed with them in their Chelsea flat on one occasion, and she witnessed the acrimony within their relationship for herself. She took an instant dislike to John Sweeney and felt that he was not right for her sister.
In late 1987, Melissa was deported from the UK when her visa expired. Realizing an opportunity to break away from her unstable relationship with John, she moved to Vienna. But she wasn't free of him for long.
The love of his life was leaving, and as far as he was concerned, and he didn't really want that relationship to end, so he followed her.
The domestic violence continued, and during a particularly ferocious row, John attacked Melissa with a hammer, cracking her skull, resulting in her requiring emergency surgery.